they all say. That's right, I'ma do this thing my way. Let's go. Been grinding hard on it all day. Okay, we work hard, then we all play. Yeah, I'm addicted to the grind, man.
So you're an independent journalist, and your focus, from what I can understand, Jeremy, is on exposing the mainstream media and kind of their deceptive practices. So can you just kind of talk a little bit about what your focus is on and how you ended up focusing on that? Or is that something that, you know, truth and honesty, you kind of developed at a younger age, and you saw this kind of deceptive practices that honed you in on this kind of area?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, what it was is, well, the events of 9/11 and then the Iraq War, and how the events of 9/11 were used as a pretext to launch that pre-planned war of aggression against Iraq for regime change based on lies. And so I was speaking out, you know, kind of just being an activist at that point in my life, just trying to warn people, family, friends, just saying, you know, like, look, the government is lying. There's no evidence. And I was doing research at that point, and I would look at like UN documents from the 90s with the UN weapons inspectors, and comparing like the UN researchers, or, you know, the investigators on the ground, their reports of like Iraq's weapons of mass destruction programs, and comparing to what the US government was saying about how there's still active programs and things. And it's just like a complete night and day difference. Like, I was documenting that the government was lying. And it was really kind of in a way, a bit of a traumatizing experience for me, because I was just shocked at how like facts didn't matter to people. They didn't care. They were just so gung-ho, like just wanting to believe what they were told. And I realized what happened. It was like there's a psychological barrier, because people they have this view of the government, right? Almost like a religious view of what the government is and what the nature of the government is. And they couldn't bring themselves to believe that the government would lie to start a war. It was just, it conflicted with their worldview and everything that they were taught to believe about the US government. And so there was just that psychological barrier where like people just would not accept just clear documentation of how the government was lying. And so that was kind of what really got me started down this path to doing independent journalism, was just that experience of trying to speak out, to do what little I could as an individual to like just stop the war that was, that was going to happen, because of the government lying. And then the role of the media at that time was, atrocious, of how the media were just parroting government claims as though fact, and really just serving to manufacture consent for the war by manipulating public opinion in favor of believing these lies that were being told by the government. And so that was really just kind of this eye-opening experience to me, just dealing with that and doing what, trying to do what I can to make a difference. And that really just kind of got me motivated to really, just start doing that. I mean, it wasn't something, I'm not trained as a journalist. I didn't go to school for it. It was just, I just felt like I was a concerned citizen of the planet Earth, just trying to do something to make a difference, just being opposed to violence and war and bloodshed. It's just something I felt like I could do in my small capacity. And so at that time, actually, after 9/11, I actually moved to Taiwan. I had bought my plane ticket right before the events, and then I moved to Taiwan right after the events of 9/11. And that's really when I just kind of discovered the internet, and just in like being outside of the US propaganda, media propaganda system, where I'm watching the evening news on TV, and just getting my information from all kinds of different perspectives and points of view, the newspapers from different countries all around the world, and just kind of having this library at my fingertips to be able to research. And of course, that's how I was able to, find UN documents from the 90s, for example. And so just kind of, I had, before that, I would say I was, above average in terms of my knowledge of world events and things, but I was still naive enough at that time in my life to ask myself this question of why would people do this? The terrorist attacks of 9/11. And then, of course, the Bush administration's response, that is because they hate our freedoms. And I was at least well enough aware to recognize what BS that was. But I still didn't have an answer for myself. And so I just started researching and digging. And then, of course, by the end of 2002, it was already clear how they were trying to use that as a pretext for the Iraq War. And so I started speaking out against that as well. And then, I've covered down the road a ways. I launched a website called Foreign Policy Journal. Again, just something that I was kind of doing in my spare time. It was kind of a hobby, I guess I would say, just doing writing and researching and writing, just something that I felt compelled to do because the mainstream media aren't doing it. They're not doing their jobs. And so I just kind of felt like I had a kind of a unique ability, I would say. I kind of have this analytical skill in terms of being able to, get pieces of information, these dots, right? And be able to kind of connect the dots and to reconcile contradictions and to be able to kind of like discern like, okay, what is the truth here? Because we're being told so many different contradictory things. Like, how do we know what the truth is? And I guess I kind of had a bit of a natural skill at being able to do that type of analysis and synthesis of information. And so I just kind of felt called to kind of use that skill to really start sharing and combating the propaganda that we are bombarded with on any issue. You name an important issue, and we're bombarded with propaganda.
And we hear that,
yeah.
we kind of hear that term, media propaganda, and I don't think most people understand really what that means. Can you really kind of put in perspective and define what does it really mean when we say media propaganda? Like, what does that mean? Does that mean that they're telling 90% truth and 10% lies? Or how can you just really put in perspective for an average person
Yeah.
the media today? And when you say propaganda, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There's a lot of different tactics and propaganda devices that they use. It might be just straight up lying, including like mischaracterizing their own cited sources. This is a big one. I mean, like if half my articles on my website, I feel like if you go through and read them, it's like the same methodology in terms of how I do it. It's like, okay, here's what the New York Times, for example, is saying. Here's the source that they cite. Here's what that source says. And so you can see how the Times is lying to you just from looking at their own sources. That's an example. So sometimes they just blatantly, brazenly lie, and just spread false information, misinformation, disinformation. Other times they just omit critical context. Like they'll say something and it will. Example, I was reading a New York Times article this morning from this past week. It was purporting to present the viewpoint of Palestinian Americans on what's happening in Gaza and the situation and just the general conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. So purporting to present the kind of the Palestinian point of view. And yet when they got around to talking about the origin of Israel and Israel's establishment in 1948, somehow they managed to omit the Palestinian perspective of that seminal event in history and how Israel came into being through the ethnic cleansing of the majority of the Palestinian inhabitants from their homes in Palestine. Like, how can the New York Times purport to be presenting the Palestinian point of view on specifically, and the subheading of the article was that the Palestinian Americans feel that the media is missing historical context in their coverage of the war, and then the New York Times proved that very point by purporting to present their perspective without mentioning the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of 1948, which was the means by which Israel came into existence. So that's an example of just completely missing critical historical context. And so sometimes it's just withholding context. So there's all kinds of propaganda devices. And I just want to say, so one of the best books on this topic is called, and I'm borrowing the phrase from Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, in which they explain, again, to answer your question, it's really easy for people to understand, the term propaganda if you're talking about, like a communist country or just authoritarian totalitarian regime somewhere where like the media is owned by the state, for example, and it's just state-owned media, and then it's really easy to, people don't have any kind of misconception of what propaganda means in a system like that. But what I think confuses people, as Chomsky and Herman address in the book, is that people have this idea that we have a free press, and that that the media serve as kind of this kind of a fourth branch of the government, in a way where their job is to kind of supposed to be to be critical of government policies and hold the government accountable, and to really inform the citizenry. And of course, the founding fathers stressed the importance of a free press and a free media, to that end, the importance of reining in government through the media and through just an informed citizenry. And unfortunately, we don't have we have a completely misinformed and uninformed citizenry, and so the government is getting away with crimes. I mean, and that's really what I focus on, is how essentially I specialize in debunking mainstream propaganda that serves to manufacture consent for criminal government policies. And so in the book, Manufacturing Consent, they detail how it works, because even though the government isn't directly controlling the media, and yet there's this system through which there's these filters that they describe in the book of how it can be that the mainstream media fulfill this function, this propaganda function, in service to the state, in supposedly democratic societies where there's a supposed free press. And this is it's just, people need to understand that is a function that the media fulfill. The mainstream corporate media fulfill this function. And of course, there's, and they kind of sometimes pretend to have, these debates on different things, but it's always, whatever disagreements and debates there are on things and in differing points of view, it's always limited to this just narrow range of allowable opinion. And anything outside of that is just considered, like it's just ignored. Or if it's mentioned, it's completely mischaracterized. There's straw man argumentation where they attribute this point of view to someone who has a different point of view, but they completely mischaracterize the point of view to be able to demonize it or dismiss it, rather than addressing the legitimate points made by this people who share this alternative perspective. There's all kinds of propaganda devices like this that they use to limit the range of the debate that occurs on an issue. And so you're really not getting anything like an objective picture when you're reading mainstream media accounts or watching the TV news.
Yeah. So would you say that it's accurate to state that we do have state-run media with just a facade that it's a free press?
No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't put it that way. Although we could talk about, like, for example, the CIA's infiltration of the mainstream media. What was it? Operation Mockingbird, I think was the name, if memory serves. And which I'm sure still goes on today. I'm sure the CIA has all kinds of assets in mainstream media organizations. It certainly wouldn't surprise me. But it's more to me. Again, I like to borrow a term from Noam Chomsky, where he describes the state religion. And so to me, it's kind of more of just this a belief system that journalists are not immune to, and they tend not to be able to break out of their own indoctrination. And how journalists are like other citizens, where they look at the U.S. government and they think, yes, America, this great country, this great force for freedom in the world, and they report through that lens, right? And so it's just kind of it's this ingrained belief system. It's that's why I like the phrase the state religion. And so it's more of that. I think there's a lot of self-censorship where people just will and confirmation biases. So a journalist might accept information that tends to conform with their own worldview, while rejecting information that contradicts it. This is just a human nature that people have confirmation biases. And so we really need to learn how to recognize our own confirmation biases and really try to overcome them if we really want to, if we really are like truth seekers, if we really want to know what is the truth and like what position should I have on this position, what is the right position on any given issue, what is right, what is wrong. For me, that's really important. It's kind of part of who I am. I want to know the truth. I want to know what is the right position to have on an issue. And I tend not to express opinions on issues I don't know much about, because you can't really form, I want to keep an open mind and not form like any type of like hard, firm conclusion about things until I get enough information to be able to do that reasonably. And I think too often people just tend to have beliefs about things or opinions about things that they kind of just get from others. It's like other people tell them what to think and they just kind of go along with it. And they don't really do a lot of critical thinking for themselves. And unfortunately, critical thinking is a skill that people need to develop. I think every news consumer needs to have certain skills to be a savvy news consumer. And unfortunately, even journalists don't seem to have a lot of the skills that are really required to be able to do this type of information analysis and to really overcome their own confirmation biases and take an objective, hard look at and really honestly search for truth.
Yeah, so you mentioned a couple of things. So Operation Mockingbird, in my understanding, that's when the CIA started to deliberately implant their employees and or get news broadcasters and at these different media agencies, I believe in the 60s or 70s, and start disseminating information that they wanted the public to consume. Just like my understanding is that, that continues to today.
Planting
A
stories
vast majority, some people say a vast majority of these so-called news broadcasters, journalists, all of the public-facing faces of these different shows on television work on behalf of, in different ways, these government agencies, especially the CIA. And they do that knowingly. Some of them do it unknowingly. Some of them are just neutral and follow whatever directions their supervisor tells them to do, or else their salary is gone, their benefits are gone. Being a famous person or in the public profile is gone. So they continue to share information that's not true. And so Jeremy, like what percentage, from studying this for a long time, what percentage would you say of our mainstream media is corrupt or controlled? What percentage of these big news stations that we all know of and these magazines, along with the social media companies that have been proven through evidence that there are hundreds, if not more, federal agents inside the actual social media companies like Twitter, like Facebook, and not just the guests, actually participating, coordinating, controlling information that's consumed by the social media customers. Okay. So all that said, like what percentage of news media and mainstream media would you say is corrupt and or controlled by those who are in control?
Well, that's a tough question because it kind of depends. Different media sources have different kind of perspectives or angles that they tend to report on different issues. So one source A might be pretty good on a certain topic and pretty fair and pretty objective, but on other topics they're just completely propagandistic in their reporting. And so it kind of depends on the topic, but generally I would a general answer is 100%. I mean, you can't trust, this kind of leads to the question I'm often asked, well, what media sources do you trust? And I say none of them. And that's the whole key, is that you really need to get, if you're only getting your information from Fox News or from CNN or from the New York Times or from NBC News, like if you have like one or two or even just a handful of sources that you get your information from, you're not being informed. You have to get your information from every source. And I don't mean you need to spend all day reading like I do. You don't have to become like an independent researcher who spends all his time doing that. But once you do develop kind of certain skills, you kind of know where to look for, okay, well, here's what the New York Times told me. Let me go see what Haaretz in Israel is reporting about this. Just getting different perspectives. What's Al Jazeera saying? What's the BBC saying? Just like knowing where to go to get different perspectives, or when other perspectives kind of come your way, taking the opportunity to check out those sources and see what they're saying, and really kind of get it. The first step is to kind of get an understanding of what are the different perspectives, because if you want to know what the other perspectives are, and so you kind of have to dig to at least a little bit. You kind of do have to do a little bit of legwork and put the time and effort into doing that, and just finding alternative sources, and go to the sources you typically don't like. If you think that Fox News is terribly biased, well, you should be looking at what Fox News is saying about a topic, because you want to know. Even if like I subscribe to the New York Times. Why? Well, because I want to know what the latest propaganda narratives are. I want to know what they're saying. So I'm constantly, and this is something I do in my articles, is I don't ignore, I don't present an argument and just ignore the opposing points of view. Quite the contrary. I anticipate what the objections would be from people who would disagree with me, and I preempt those objections in my articles, which is one of the reasons why I tend to write such long form content, because I write really thorough, detailed, documented arguments where I'm preempting any possible rebuttals to what I'm saying, because I am already aware of what those rebuttals would be, because I am reading so many sources from points of view that I don't agree with. So I know what they're saying, and if I'm at the same time, just because I might start out disagreeing with a certain point of view, but the more I learn about it, I realize, oh, actually, my opinion about that, or my perception of that was incorrect, and then you change your mind about things, right? We have to be willing to change our mind about things. The more we learn, and as we consume knowledge, but if you're not being even exposed to alternative points of views, and you're not deliberately exposing yourself to points of views that you don't necessarily agree with, then you're not challenging yourself, and you're being intellectually lazy. And we all need to be you put a little bit more effort in, because the world, frankly, depends on it. Like future generations of humanity depend on us doing that, because if we don't, it's just people get away with lies and criminal activity, and there's just wars and bloodshed. You brought up the censorship regime, which pre-existed the COVID-19 pandemic, but during the lockdowns and their coerced mass vaccination endgame of the lockdowns, the censorship just got so brazen and so blatant, and it's just so explicit of what they were doing. And of course, they're always couching it in terms of, oh, well, we're stopping the spread of misinformation. Well, but misinformation is just their euphemism for any information, no matter how factual, that doesn't accord with the official policy. So, for example, with the lockdowns, or with the mass vaccination endgame. So, for example, I was banned from LinkedIn for accurately reporting how the CDC's August 2021 claim that natural immunity is inferior to the immunity conferred by the COVID-19 vaccines was contradicted at the time by virtually all of the non-CDC originating medical literature, and was subsequently falsified by the CDC's own data, as reported by its own researchers in its own journal. And so for accurately reporting that, I got banned from LinkedIn. This is an example of the type of censorship. Like you can't speak truth. And so they use misinformation as it's a euphemism. And of course, this was going on before COVID. So, to the point where I had actually written an ebook about this issue pre-COVID, where for Children's Health Defense, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s organization, I wrote an ebook for their organization. And so you can go to their website and go to the ebook section, and you can download this free ebook. And it was about how the censorship was so bad then, that like just the simple act of going on social media and not making any claims, not making any factual claims, just simply going on social media and advocating the right to informed consent. Just that parents have a right to decide for themselves about childhood vaccinations. Just saying that this is the right to informed consent, which is non-controversial. I mean, this is codified in U.S. and international law that people have a right to informed consent. It's basic human rights. And yet, just for advocating that, that has been defined as spreading misinformation. And I'm talking about specifically about a paper that was published in the journal Vaccine on the topic of supposed spread of misinformation. And that was one of the examples that they gave in that study, supposed study.
Right. And so let's talk about that a little bit more, because, and I want to get this point across, is that it doesn't matter whether or not your source is credible and correct and accurate and honest. That's not what they're questioning. They're not even having that debate or discussion or opposing view.
No, precisely.
It's that this random guy, Jeremy, is posting something that other people may consume that will end up revealing and exposing a fake campaign.
Yes.
So whatever their campaign is trying to achieve. So in this case, they're trying to achieve whatever end result they want of people injecting themselves with these chemicals. And anyone posing anything against, let's call it a narrative, they can't have that. So they're not even discussing or opposing that your sources and your citations are incorrect. That's irrelevant to them. They simply need to get this guy Jeremy off and to remove anything he's posting. And anyone like Jeremy, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on the news, whether it's on any social media accounts. So, and that's what everybody saw. Finally, they actually saw a deliberate censorship is the right word, but it's too weak of a word. It's more of a dismantling of their of exposure of their crime. So anyone exposing or revealing their crimes against humanity, essentially, they need to make sure that opposing information is not out there for people to consume, because now they're going to have a problem where people are realizing that 100% of the news, and social media is included in that, is false, fake, narrative controlled by the decision makers, whether it's called the deep state or the matrix or whoever it is. And that's a very, very difficult reality to really understand and digest. I think still for most people, even going through the COVID campaign, I still don't think people really understand what they experienced the last 3 years with the COVID campaign. Arguing whether it's deadly, it's not deadly, is the wrong argument. It's a distraction of a debate. What people don't understand is that was an actual and continues to be an actual campaign, just like other topics which you talked about, Jeremy. And those are all distractions that you have people bickering back and forth about each other. They're not even realizing why the decision makers have handed these two people who are bickering that particular argument. So anyone like Jeremy or Michael or anyone who's actually discussing things, they will go ahead, as we know with Joe Rogan and all these other high profile people, they will diminish their credibility. They will attempt to diminish their character. They will literally, I mean, if you have a sitting president, whoever it is, and you literally take off the sitting president of the United States account of multiple social media companies simultaneously, that's not a coincidence. So it doesn't matter who it is. If you're not part of the corruption, the decision makers, whoever they are, and if you know who they are, we could talk about that. We'll go ahead and try to dismantle and remove and discredit anyone, including a random guy named Jeremy or Michael, whoever that's on LinkedIn. They cannot have anything that opposes their misinformation online or anywhere else for people to consume. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. You made some really excellent points there, and that I would like to expand on. So yeah, in fact, the entire mainstream media establishment, it tries to characterize itself as the sole source of truth, and you can't trust stuff you read on the internet, and you can't trust independent journalists. You need to turn to us. We are the credible authorities when it comes to news media. That's how they characterize themselves. And there's been a concerted effort to kind of try to delegitimize independent journalism, like truly independent journalism. You know, like I have, like, nobody pays me to do what I do. I'm totally independent. My work is reader funded. So nobody pays me a wage, salary, grant, and, you know, the commission. Like, I just research what I want to research, because I have certain topics I feel are important that people aren't getting good information about, and I provide that value to people of giving them good information, with the sources that they can then go and check and verify, so they don't have to take my word for anything. Because I certainly don't expect people to do that. And so that's, you know, there's been this, you know, I was myself was a kind of a victim of that whole kind of media campaign around about 2019, where the Washington Post at one point had cited this list of a group called Prop or Not, Propaganda or Not, and my website, Foreign Policy Journal, was cited on that list as one of these websites that supposedly was spreading Russian disinformation. So a Russia propaganda outlet. Of course, I have no connection to Russia. But the reason that my website was put on that list, evidently, was simply because I was publishing articles criticizing U.S. policy, for example, in Syria, where it was butting heads with the Russian policy of supporting Assad in Syria against terrorist groups, including ISIS, and the U.S. was siding with the terrorists against Bashar al-Assad. And so for reporting this, you know, from this critical perspective of U.S. policy, for example, you know, this propaganda, there was the whole propaganda narrative that was designed to kind of manufacture consent for this U.S. intervention in Syria, where it was through the CIA funneling arms to the most radical extremists in Syria, via Qatar and I think Saudi Arabia, and so which was just worsening and prolonging the violence and the conflict, but to write critically from that point of view, and then there was this narrative. The whole media narrative was that, you know, the problem in Syria is that the U.S. hasn't intervened, and you had all these hawks, you know, these warmongers. And their perspective was just like dominant in the mainstream media narrative, that the problem is the U.S. needs to get in there and intervene, because that's why this disaster is happening. It was precisely the opposite. It was precisely because the U.S. was in there intervening and just making the problem so much worse, that became such a devastating conflict. So that's just an example. And so my website, you know, got put on this kind of list of supposed Russian propaganda, just for presenting that point of view and providing facts, and you know, like citing the New York Times, for example. The New York Times itself had reported at one point how the arms that were being funneled were ending up in the hands of the most violent extremists. I mean, that I'm citing the New York Times itself, and yet, because later on the New York Times just kind of whitewashes that and it forgets about it. And so in subsequent reporting, like, that whole context is just like completely whitewashed, and they just never return to it again. And so you kind of got to dig into the archives to find nuggets of truth like that. And so around that time, after that happened, just my website's Google ranking, you know, like my search results, I had articles that for many years were just like dominating search engine results for very popular keyword research phrases. And yet it just suddenly my site was disappeared from Google, as an example. Like, and I don't think that was a coincidence that happened right around the time that my site got, you know, listed as this Russian propaganda outlet. So that's an example of, you know, how I was affected as an independent journalist, by this media campaign where they're just trying to delegitimize any kind of independent journalism, and effectively doing so. You know, going back to the whole point about the use of misinformation as a euphemism, and you brought up the term that it doesn't, they're not even looking at what the facts are. Like, it's not even an investigation of, oh, well, this person made this claim, is that true, what are the facts? They're not doing that. And there's a whole body of research on what's called vaccine hesitancy. But the fundamental premise of all of this so-called research, you know, it's propaganda masquerading as science, just like there's journalists who masquerade, or propagandists, professional propagandists who masquerade as journalists. There's also professional propagandists who masquerade as scientists. And so they have this whole body of literature called on what's called vaccine hesitancy. But the founding premise, the starting point of all of that research is that there are no legitimate reasons for anyone to not follow CDC's recommendations when it comes to vaccines. That's just a basic assumption. It is unquestionable. That's the premise. And so naturally, the only reason, if you start with that premise, the only logical conclusion that can follow is that the only reason anyone might not choose to get this or that vaccine is because they've been duped by misinformation about vaccines. It's begging the question. They're begging the question. It's the logic of fallacy. And so they start with this premise that there is no legitimate reason not to follow CDC's guidelines, and everything else follows from that. So they're not even looking at the question of like, is what this person's saying, is it true? Another example of me getting censored on LinkedIn, which for some reason, most people talk about Facebook and Twitter in terms of the censorship. I've actually experienced, I haven't gotten too badly censored by, well, certainly Twitter, the least of the three. Facebook more so, much more so, but LinkedIn has been the worst and the most aggressive against me personally. Where most recently I shared an article accurately reporting, and there were numerous articles I saw on this topic. I didn't share certain of them because I felt that they weren't accurate enough. So even though it was an important story, I didn't share that information because there was some misinformation mixed in with the important story. And so I deliberately, I'm very choosy about what I share, and so I selected an article that was very well written, very professionally done by a well-respected journalist. And the topic was on how the Pfizer vaccine has been found to be contaminated with DNA. And the story was about how there was this genomics expert, cancer genomics expert, who testified, I think it was South Carolina Senate committee, about the risks posed by this DNA contamination in the mRNA vaccine, and how it could result in integration of that vaccine material into the human genome, and also raising risk of potential cancer, things like this. And so this was an expert speaking his expertise in his field, and yet I that post of mine, just for sharing that article and with a quote from that expert, the quote from the testimony he gave, and sharing the link, that post got blocked by LinkedIn as misinformation. And then LinkedIn has this whole supposed appeals, probably call it an appeal process, but there is no appeal process, because it's just all you can do is just ask them to take a second look, which they do, and they come back and say, yep, it's misinformation. And you ask them, like, well, can you specify what it is, what information you're claiming is false or misleading? And they won't do it. They refuse. And then they have in their policy, this is just like a deep dive into like a really intense look at, I don't want to go on too long, but I think it's important for people to understand how it works, of how the censorship works, because as you mentioned, I think a lot of people really just don't even understand what went down and just how extreme this censorship regime was and is and continues to be. Because so I would ask LinkedIn, for example, they say in their guidelines that they always point me to their guidelines and say, oh, well, you violated this part of the guidelines, and I point out how they say, well, that under the guidelines that you can't spread misinformation, including anything that kind of contradicts what public health authorities are saying. And so I would specifically ask LinkedIn, does that mean that I am prohibited from sharing factually accurate information that contradicts misinformation from the CDC? Ask them a pointed question like that. And the response is, we do not provide interpretations of the community guidelines. So this is how they're getting away with it. So of course, that's what it means. Of course, they're using misinformation as a euphemism, meaning anything contradicting, no matter how factually accurate, anything that contradicts the quote unquote public health authorities. That's how it works. And so people need to understand this. And of course, there is all kinds of true misinformation out there on both sides, but the greatest purveyors of misinformation and disinformation about vaccines or any topic is the US government and the mainstream media. And people need to understand this.
Right. And so to be clear, it's the mainstream media on behalf of the US government / decision makers, whoever these people at the top of the pyramid are.
Yeah, and in this
Right? Like
instance,
they're
also in
the
service to the pharmaceutical industry. Yes.
correct, right? So at the top of the pyramid, in the current structure, the current Truman Show, if you will, that we're all living in, the manufactured, produced Truman Show, if you will, for folks who have seen that. And if you haven't, I highly recommend people to go see it. Is at the top of the pyramid are the decision makers, and those are that could be entities and companies that we've all kind of heard of and know of, who own a vast majority of almost everything. But in those companies are individuals, as well, right? So people running those big trillion-dollar, multi-trillion-dollar more companies. And then maybe even beyond those people, you have maybe some people in the shadows that a lot of people like to refer to as the deep state, the people in control, the people who are making the decisions. So there is a trickle-down effect. And the corrupt politicians that we see are just the public-facing part of that scheme, if you will, and so people always get mad at those politicians, which is correct. And beyond them, there's their supervisors, if you will, their managers, if you will, and then beyond those people are the highest level decision makers. You also have the financiers, like Bill Gates, George Soros, and some of the other ones, who are the financiers, because it takes money to manipulate billions of people and continue to manipulate billions of people on an ongoing basis. It's a very expensive endeavor. And so you have the financiers, but even those financiers, whom I mentioned and maybe others, those people may or may not actually be the real decision makers. The guy might say, yeah, I got some billions of dollars to spare. I'll go ahead and buy all the farmland in the United States on your behalf. You know what I mean? I'll go ahead and I'll fund all of these, appear to be non-government organizations and nonprofits, and we'll put a nice name on it, like pro-liberty, even though it's not, and all the other stuff on your behalf. So the people at the top, along with those folks below them, need to be identified. And we're going to talk about solutions in a little bit. I don't want to get into that right now, but this is kind of what's happening. So there are people who are decision makers, and then there are people who act on behalf of those decision makers. And we see those as, some of the CEOs, some of the politicians, some of the news broadcasters, and Mark Zuckerberg, and all the other people. The president can be, right? All these other people are the public-facing people on behalf of the decision makers. So there's a hierarchy there. So can you walk? Since you've been studying this for a long time, like you said earlier, you see patterns and you see formulas that work. So in other words, how do they manipulate the public? What is the formula that you see that works, where they do this, then they do this, then on behalf of these people, the media does this? Can you walk through a manipulation campaign? And can you do it without using an existing one? So just like talking in general, because I think that's easier for people to comprehend. So if you say like climate change or all the other topics, they're gonna start saying, no, he's wrong. I just like a generic one. If you were to start a new manipulation campaign today, how does the funnel work to manipulate everyone listening to the news?
So it starts with just establishing what the narrative is going to be. And of course, the narrative is designed to gain support for whatever the policy is. So there's a policy agenda, and then so there's an argument that's going to be created, crafted, engineered with certain talking points that are going to be repeated over and over and over again by every media outlet. And it's always going to be always the same talking points over and over again. And so on one hand, which is designed to lead people to a certain conclusion, the conclusion being, this is a policy I can get behind. I support this policy, or at least, or minimally to people won't care about it and not have an opinion about it. But basically, just as long as they don't oppose it, we don't want people opposing this policy, whatever the political agenda might be. So that's the first thing. And then, of course, once it's not enough to just put that narrative out there, because there might be counter narratives. There might be opposing points of view. And so this is where the media come in terms of limiting and confining the debate. They pretend that there is a debate, but it's like they present points of view that, where it just serves the purpose still of creating this illusion of freedom of press and this illusion that there's like a real significant debate going on where like this is a reasoned discourse, and it's completely sidelining real alternative points of view, and so it's that in which you do have to go to those alternative sources on the internet to be able to find those points of view, because they never make it into the mainstream discourse. They're just completely sidelined. And so, and I gave, well, you said not to give a specific example, so I won't mention any, but because I agree with you. If I pick a specific topic, climate change, whatever it might be, it's going to be, well, people to disagree with that. But this is how it works, generically speaking, of just there's certain talking points that you won't see real arguments against, because those counter arguments are just not being presented. They're being completely delegitimized by the mainstream media, saying we are the source of truth and we are going to provide objective journalism, but of course they don't.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is there are entities that are kind of work in tandem. They coordinate in order to send out a new manipulation campaign, whatever it might be. Whether it's, I want to go to war, so let's start creating conflict. I want these two demographics to start fighting, so let's start, doing articles about how these two demographics are harming each other, so they could start arguing in the streets and creating conflict, or whatever it might be. So the decision makers have an objective, and they develop how they're going to implement and execute this objective, just like a business would, like a legitimate business would. And then they start using their partnerships and their communication access to send out and disseminate the narrative, which is usually all false, made up lies, and simply for the manipulation of the general public to consume. So
and sometimes this includes
like
hand-picking journalists to feed information to, because they know which journalists are going to be sympathetic to the policy agenda. And so sometimes they will hand-pick journalists and say, okay, we're going to hand this story to this journalist.
Headley. And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about trouble and irresponsible, one-sided news stories
plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
the sharing of biased and
False news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 This is extremely dangerous to our
Hand
democracy.
this story to this journalist. And so yes, that's essentially what happens. And of course, also it's not always like there's this direct coordination that happens. It's certainly like we see it. You brought up the great example with the social media companies, how there was like direct government involvement in the decisions being made by social media companies to censor certain voices. So a lot of times there is just this direct coordination, whether it's that type of direct coordination or picking which journalists Or the media will just like publish press releases as though it's news, things like this. But it's not always like this type of direct coordination. Sometimes it's just kind of what I referred to earlier as the state religion and the influence of the indoctrination system, which of course goes to the point of some of the problems with public schooling. And government schools, of course, are going to teach children this propaganda, this indoctrination of that we need the government is good, and without the government we'd all we need the government to take care of us, and these kinds of things. I mean, they're not going to present a different point of view than that. And so there's this indoctrination that's happening where people grow up believing that with U.S. foreign policy, you see it with the belief in American exceptionalism, and so it's also just this kind of belief system that that there doesn't need. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that there doesn't need to be actual like direct coordination for this to happen, because it's just there are people who are just kind of like robotically doing that role anyways. They don't need to have direct coordination. They don't need to actually be like paid CIA assets or something to be doing what they're doing. It's just like that's just in their nature. It's
right.
It's
They've yeah, I would probably say also even more so direct is that they've been brainwashed after consuming the manipulation. So
they believe their own propaganda. Yeah,
correct. Yeah, and right, that's right. Where they actually now, like you said, believe their own propaganda, and they've been brainwashed through manipulation. So they're actually victims of the manipulation, and they don't understand they're victims of the manipulation.
Yeah, perfectly said. Yep.
Yeah. So through propaganda, which is basically has a goal of manipulating the consumer of the propaganda to do something. What are the emotions? So there's a formula. This is all has been studied and analyzed and understood by all the psychologists, all the experts in this field. This is not when they use colors, when they use a certain word or words, when they use, especially words, when they use a certain background, when they use timing, when they use graphics on the news screen, all of that is very deliberately used through years and years of understanding of psychology. So how do we best manipulate these people, these victims, to do what we want them to do? And they use all these different factors, including emotions. So they prey on humanity's natural emotions. So can you talk about what are the most effective emotions that these propagandists, which are the media, the corrupt people in the government, and the corrupt companies, et cetera, what do they use? What emotions are most effective to manipulate the general public?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point about how they use emotional triggers, and also, graphic design. You mentioned colors and things. Yes, like colors, certain colors, different colors evoke different feelings and emotions. And if anyone who studies web design will tell you that, like, when brands select what their brand colors are going to be, they think these are things that they consider, like what are the psychological effects of this color on people. So there's no that's not a secret. And the biggest one that comes to mind in terms of which emotions are they trying to trigger, the biggest one in at least as far as most of the work that I do is fear. Fear of Saddam Hussein, fear of Al-Qaeda, fear of Osama bin Laden, fear of ISIS, fear of Russia, fear of SARS-CoV-2. That's like most of the work that I do, like that's the big one. It's just terrifying people, to make them afraid, and to believe that we need the government to take this action in order to protect us and keep us safe.
COVID, gangbusters with ratings. COVID, gangbusters with ratings, right? Which is why we constantly have the death toll on the side. Let's make it higher. Like, why isn't it high enough, today? Like, it would make our point better if it was higher. It's fear. Like, fear really drives numbers. Fear is the thing that keeps you tuned in. If it bleeds, it leads. Yeah.
If it bleeds, it leads?
Yeah. No one ever says those things out loud, but it's obvious.
What you're about to see is so shocking. Admissions about COVID, its impact, the bias, and things that we've all suspected but have never been able to confirm until now.
Sad news doesn't do well with ratings, you know, like if you can get someone impassioned, that does really well with ratings. Sad news back to back to back doesn't do really well unless it affects them directly. COVID, gangbusters with ratings, right? Which is why we constantly have the death toll on the side, which I have a major problem with, that we're tallying how many people die every day. Because I've even looked at it and be like, let's make it higher. Like, why isn't it high enough, you know, today? Like, it would make our point better if it was higher. And I'm like, what am I rallying for? That's a problem. Yeah. We're doing that, you know? Like the special red phone ring. Yeah. And they pick it up, and it's like the head of the network being like, there's nothing that you're doing right now that makes me want to stick. Put the numbers back up, because that's the most enticing thing that we have. So put it back up. So like things like that are constantly talked about. I mean, there's no such thing as unbiased news. It just doesn't exist. Any reporter on CNN, what they're actually doing is they're telling the person what to say. It's always like leading them in a direction before they even open their mouth. And the only people that we will let on the air, for the most part, are people that have a proven track record of taking the bait.
That's it, as far as the focus of my work has been. That's the biggest one. Of course, there are others. Anger, you know, just eliciting anger, an angry emotional response from people, you know, against whatever the target might be, whether it's a person or an organization, just eliciting this strong emotional response against something or against someone. You know, playing maybe sadness could be one where, you know, you're trying to create this sympathy in the target of the propaganda, to have this sympathetic view towards, you know, one side of an issue, for example. Again, trying to avoid specifics and just speak generically. So yeah, there's any range, but you know, the absolute biggest one in my perception is fear, and just the use of fear as a marketing tactic. And the CDC is a perfect example. I mean, it literally it had a presentation to the Institute of Medicine quite a few years back. I think probably mid 2000s. I think it was. Escapes my recollection exactly when this was, but the CDC had this presentation that they delivered on flu shots and how to promote its policy. Of course, the policy being, and this is a big thing, you know, look at what is the CDC's goal? Is the goal to provide people with the information they need to be able to make an informed choice about whether to get a flu shot this season? No, of course not. They want people to get the damn shot no matter what. So their policy is to achieve a high vaccination rate, and everything follows from that. And so they had this presentation that they gave explaining the use of fear marketing to elicit this fear of this virus in people, and you know, like giving specific guidance for like what words to use to describe this year's flu season. So every flu season is always like deadly and severe and worse than prior flu seasons, and like they use language like this deliberately just to elicit fear in people that, oh, I better go get that flu shot or I'm going to die from the flu. And it's a deliberate, explicit policy that this is what they do in terms of manipulating people's emotions. So that's just a really clear-cut example of what I'm talking about, of how fear is just deliberately used in mainstream media, government propaganda that's parroted by the mainstream media.
The mainstream media is 100% corrupt. Their only intention is to share information they've been ordered and to share with you, the public. And that's why I think independent journalists like yourself are extremely important, and people having the analytical skills and critical skills to analyze things objectively on their own is extremely important, which they have deliberately eroded in schools. Being able to analyze things has been deliberately eroded in schools so that people cannot actually do that on their own. So tell me, Jeremy, when people like yourself come out and other people come out, just, average people or non-independent journalists, and they say, hey, it looks like you are wrong about this, or it looks like it's what you're saying about this is wrong, or I disagree with you. What are the tactics that the media uses to shut people down? You mentioned, for example, LinkedIn, which is just one social media site, but they all do this. They pretend it's that you violated the terms of service, even when you don't, and even when you didn't. So what tactics, do they use? Because it's almost always the same. There's only about like 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever tactics that they use. So can you kind of speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Before I do, you just raised so many great points about obstacles, right? Like people don't have time to do the research. Who has time? People are working, they have jobs, they have families. Like, who has time to do a research project just to find out like what the truth is about a given issue? That is a serious obstacle that we need to try to overcome. Discomfort people feel. You brought up this point again about people. There's a certain reality. They just can't deal with reality. They tend, and I just want to make the point on that topic before I move on. There are people who will prefer to believe the lies. They convince themselves that the lies are true because it's more comfortable for them. They can't deal with the discomfort of accepting the truth. And so there's that psychological issue that, that people have cognitive dissonance, where they might have two completely conflicting, contradictory beliefs, and yet they believe both things are true at once. There's all kinds of psychology there. So I'm really glad you brought up some of those points. As far as tactics to silence people, really the biggest one that jumps to mind is straw man argumentation, which I think I mentioned earlier, straw man fallacy. It's a logical fallacy, where you have a position, and then you manufacture this opposing position, and you argue against that. Like an easily you create this argument that's easy to defeat with your own argument, and then you falsely attribute that straw man argument to your intellectual opponent. This is constant. This is constant in the media.
When it comes to the big media organizations and the journalists themselves, just in the profession of journalism, are there any regulations or ethics laws or license requirements that they're supposed to be complying with?
Well, apart from, you're not supposed to libel people and defame people. But short of that, nothing's jumping to mind. And of course, defamation occurs pretty regularly, but it's pretty hard to. You have to have some pretty deep pockets, I think, to start a defamation lawsuit, much less win one. But of course, ethically, it's completely abhorrent what the media frequently do. So there's ethical guidelines that you're supposed to be objective and present, that's the job of a journalist, is to try to present balanced point of view.
The media manipulation in general has been going on for a very long time. Are there any checks and balances that currently exist for a organization like these big mainstream media companies, where if they're not complying with certain rules of disseminating information to the public, that there are certain consequences, and whether or not there have ever been any consequences, or maybe there used to be, like fines or something like that, or a loss of a job for a broadcaster if they're lying, manipulating, and deceiving the public.
Well, it's happened. There has been times, I forget the name, but there was like a New York Times reporter at one point who, I forget what topic he was even writing about, but like literally fabricating stories, and the New York Times was publishing them, and then the New York Times came out and acknowledged what had happened, and that guy got canned. So sometimes there's instances like that, but really the big balance is independent journalism. And sometimes you have Twitter users, for example, just individuals on Twitter who like are like reporting something, for example. And that does break through into the mainstream. I mean, I was saying before, like a lot of times just whole perspectives like never even break through into the mainstream, but there are instances where, like citizen journalists and independent journalists are checking the mainstream media and correcting it. And sometimes those stories and those checks break through, and it becomes a situation where the narrative is changed and influenced and affected. And accountability can happen in those situations where, a journalist, for example, who put out a report containing false information or something, can be held accountable, at least in terms of people catching on to what happened and recognizing that, that this occurred. Maybe they don't always lose their job over it or anything like that, but at least the narrative is corrected in some small way. And so that's, in terms of accountability, I think that's the biggest one that occurs. I can't think of like anything, illegal checks and things like that really occur typically or often. But the really big check is just the independent citizen journalism that occurs. And sometimes also, you might have a mainstream media organization checking another mainstream media organization. This happens too. So sometimes they kind of check each other. But predominantly, at least on the top of topics where I'm writing about, it's independent sources correcting mainstream media misinformation. And sometimes those corrections are actually do break through that barrier and kind of become part of the mainstream discourse.
So just two more questions. The manipulation, so this corrupt media infrastructure that exists directly affects everything. So it's they're responsible for wars, loss of life, poverty, conflict between people and demographics who don't actually have conflict. They affect elections. They affect all countries around the world. So there's a massive, profound negative effect of having a corrupt media. So, in just a few sentences, which I know is going to be a challenge to this question, what is the solution to this massive number one problem that we have?
First, recognizing that this is the function of the mainstream media. They fulfill this propaganda function. To developing the savvy news consumerism skills, you need to have some critical thinking skills, and it's like playing a musical instrument. It's something you have to practice. And then 3, checking your own confirmation biases and really being honest and objective when you approach information and try to figure out what the truth is, and then sharing that information with others. So critical that, like I couldn't survive as an independent journalist if it wasn't for my readers sharing my information and sharing my articles. In addition to, obviously, like I mentioned, I'm dependent on reader support and donations to continue the work that I do, because I'm self-employed. I don't have an employer, and nobody pays me to do what I do. I work for my readers by delivering value to them. And so it's just so important for people to be active in correcting information and getting out there and just sharing the knowledge. And a lot of people don't want to do that. They don't want to like upset their friends or family or something by sharing certain information that's controversial, but we kind of just need to get over that and just do it.
Where can people find you, Jeremy, and support your work?
I'm at jeremyrhammond.com. And if you just go there, you can always, all my articles are published there, and you definitely sign up for my newsletter. It's to stay updated with my work.
I appreciate it, Jeremy. Let's definitely do this again.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, likewise. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, let's go. I don't care what they all say. That's right, I'ma do this thing my way. Let's go. Been grinding hard on it all day. Okay, we work hard, then we all play. Yeah, I'm addicted to the grind, man. That's right, so I refuse to waste time, man. Yeah, One day it all will be fine, man. Let's go. Gotta commit to the cause. You know